there is a pretty strong relationship between crowding and mortality. Cities that are more crowded have higher mortality. And so these are relatively large bands, but we can explain something like a quarter to maybe even up to 70% of our total mortality effects with this crowding measure, or 12 to 37 of our infectious mortality effects. Again, it's suggestive that a lot of what's going on, or at least a good share of what's going on, the reason the quotas seem to matter, the reason that reductions in immigration seem to matter for health is because of the conditions, because of the crowding conditions. I don't know how I did on time because I'm used to everyone interrupting me econ style, so I just got to blast straight through. But I'll stick the landing with a conclusion. So basically, throughout history, and when I say throughout history, I mean we have evidence in the paper of people blaming immigrants for diseases, you know, thousands upon thousands of years ago, through unfortunately all the way to today. Immigrants have been a very convenient scapegoat for all sorts of ills in the receiving societies, receiving countries, and especially for this idea that immigrants are transmitting disease to the domestic population. This is true in the early 20th century, and a lot of that rhetoric led to changes in immigration policy, including the closing of the border. We're able to use that closing of the border to sort of power our empirical specification to understand that actually it turns out closing the border did really lead to these substantial mortality improvements, especially in the more quota exposed cities. But rather than some idea about contagion or sort of the weak constitutions of the immigrants or something sort of nativist like that, it's really about the living conditions. It's about crowding and congestion. That's what's explaining these results. And that if you really approach this from like a public health perspective, it's pretty obvious that immigration crackdowns are not actually a really successful public health tool. There's much more direct ways to address the fact that like people are living many families to a tenement and don't have clean water and are sort of getting everybody else sick and dying of infectious disease. And so again, we wrote this whole paper, and then sort of as often as an economic historian, you come across contemporaries who are either totally ill-informed and other contemporaries that kind of like actually nail exactly what you're going to do in econometric terms 100 years later. And so from the National Industrial Conference Board, we found this quote, immigrants as a class are frequently blamed for bad housing and bad living conditions over which they have no control. These conditions may be due in part to the attitude of the Americans towards immigrants and the economic status of the immigrant working class. And we think this is like exactly what's going on, that the sort of connection between immigration and poor health in the early 20th century is almost entirely driven by these living conditions. And these living conditions themselves are almost entirely driven by poverty and by xenophobia. And so, hopefully this paper underscores that, the sort of the reality, the details of immigration and mortality in this period. And with that, I will conclude.